and I'm Celia, 32 years old. Once I thought I had it all married into the wealthy Richardson family with a beautiful Connecticut estate and a seemingly perfect husband. Then came that cold winter afternoon when my mother-in-law Eleanor sat me down with trembling hands and confessed a truth so terrible it would destroy everything I knew. Within days, I watched my husband James being led away in handcuffs, while I unexpectedly inherited millions in assets that somehow remained untouched by scandal. Life can change in an instant. If you're watching this, take a moment to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're viewing from. This story might just change how you see the people closest to you. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Boston, the daughter of a high school English teacher and a nurse. My parents worked hard to put me through college, where I studied art history. By 25, I had established myself as a promising curator at a small but respected gallery in Manhattan. That's where my life collided with the Richardson family. The night I met James was at our gallery's biggest opening of the year. We had secured an exclusive collection from a reclusive European artist, and New York's elite turned out in full force. I was rushing around making sure everything was perfect when I literally bumped into him, spilling champagne on his clearly expensive suit. "I'm so sorry," I gasped, mortified. But instead of being angry, he smiled. James Richardson had the kind of smile that made you forget everything else in the room. "Now you have to let me take you to dinner to make up for ruining my night," he said with a playful glint in his blue eyes. I laughed, thinking he was joking. "I think you have that backwards. I ruined your suit. But you've made my night infinitely more interesting," he countered smoothly. James was tall, with dark hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I later learned he rarely took no for an answer, a trait that had served him well in business, but would eventually reveal a darker side in our marriage. 2 days later, he sent an elaborate floral arrangement to the gallery with a note asking me to dinner. My colleagues were impressed. "That's James Richardson," my boss whispered. "His family practically owns half of Connecticut." Our first date was at a restaurant so exclusive I hadn't even heard of it. He ordered in fluent French and spoke passionately about art in a way that surprised me. By the end of the night, I was charmed. James was intelligent, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my opinions about art and my career aspirations. What followed was a whirlwind romance straight out of a fairy tale. Weekend trips to Paris on private jets. A surprise birthday gift of a rare first edition book I had once mentioned loving as a child. Backstage passes to sold-out Broadway shows. Each gesture more extravagant than the last. When he proposed after just 4 months, my friends expressed concern about the speed, but I was certain. "How could something that felt so perfect be wrong? You'll need to meet my mother before we announce the engagement," James said after I accepted his proposal. The way his expression tightened told me this wasn't just a formality. Eleanor Richardson had been running the family business since her husband's death 15 years earlier. The Richardson Investment Group had been founded by James's grandfather and had grown into a financial empire under Eleanor's stewardship. Meeting Eleanor was intimidating. The Richardson mansion was a sprawling colonial estate with manicured gardens and a driveway lined with elm trees. A butler greeted us at the door and I immediately felt underdressed, despite wearing my most expensive outfit. Eleanor was tall and elegant, with perfectly styled silver hair and penetrating green eyes that seemed to evaluate my net worth with a single glance. "So you're the gallery girl," she said, extending a hand adorned with a diamond ring larger than any I'd ever seen outside a museum display. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Richardson," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Dinner was an exercise in subtle power plays. Eleanor questioned me about my family background, my education, and my career in ways that highlighted the vast gap between my world and theirs. "Art curation, how charming," she said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "Though not particularly lucrative, is it?" "Mother," James warned softly. "I'm simply making conversation, dear," Eleanor replied with a tight smile. Despite the tension by the end of the evening, Eleanor had seemingly given her approval. "She has potential, James, she said, as if I wasn't sitting right there. With the right guidance, she could fit in quite well. Our wedding was held at the Richardson estate 6 months later. 300 guests, many of whom I'd never met. Flower arrangements flown in from Holland. A dress from a French designer who normally had a 2-year waiting list. It was beautiful, but surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Moving into the Richardson mansion after our honeymoon was another adjustment. The house had been in the family for generations, filled with antiques and artwork worth millions. There were staff members who had worked there longer than I'd been alive. "You'll get used to it," James assured me when he found me looking overwhelmed in the massive library. "This is your home now." I tried to make it feel that way, but Eleanor's constant presence made it difficult. She had her own wing of the house, but seemed to materialize whenever I was trying to make a decision about anything. "The blue china is for informal gatherings, dear," she would say, or "the east sitting room gets better light in the mornings for your coffee." James said it was her way of helping me adjust, but it felt more like a reminder that I was an outsider playing house in someone else's domain. The Richardson fortune was even more substantial than I'd initially realized. Beyond the Connecticut estate, there were properties in Manhattan, Palm Beach, and the south of France. The investment firm managed billions in assets. The art collection rivaled those of small museums. James's passion was vintage cars, with the crown jewel being a 1962 Rolls Royce Silver Cloud that had once belonged to a European royal. Then there were the Richardson diamonds, a collection of family pieces dating back generations. Eleanor wore different pieces to every social function, each one more spectacular than the last. "Someday, these will be yours to wear," she told me once, showing me a necklace featuring a flawless blue diamond. "If you prove yourself worthy of the Richardson name, of course." I tried to ignore the conditional nature of that statement. For the first year of our marriage, I was too caught up in the glamour and novelty to notice the warning signs. James insisted I give up my curator position, saying a Richardson wife didn't need to work. I agreed, thinking I could use my connections to support artists in other ways. "Besides," he said, "you'll be busy learning the social obligations that come with our position." What I didn't realize was that giving up my job was just the first step in James gradually taking control of my life. By our second anniversary, the fairy tale had begun to fade. James was traveling more frequently for business, sometimes disappearing for days, with vague explanations about investor meetings or client dinners. When he was home, he was often distracted taking phone calls in his study with the door firmly closed. "It's a delicate time for the business," he would say whenever I questioned him. "You wouldn't understand the complexities." His dismissiveness stung, but I tried to be understanding. The Richardson Investment Group had thousands of clients relying on them after all. My days fell into a structured routine approved by both James and Eleanor. Charity committee meetings, lunch with the right social connections, hosting dinner parties where the conversation carefully avoided anything too controversial or intellectual. I had become an accessory to the Richardson lifestyle rather than a partner in our marriage. When I suggested returning to work part-time at a gallery, James was surprisingly angry. "We've discussed this, Celia. Your job is here representing our family. But I miss being around art, having my own identity," I tried to explain. "Your identity is as my wife now," he said in a tone that ended the discussion. Eleanor watched these dynamics with calculating eyes, occasionally making comments that undermined my confidence. "James needs a wife who understands her role, Celia." His father and I had a perfect understanding of our responsibilities to each other and the family name. I found myself increasingly isolated. My old friends from the art world stopped calling after being repeatedly told I was too busy for lunch or coffee. My parents sensed something was wrong during their infrequent visits, but didn't know how to broach the subject. The few times my mother asked if I was happy, I assured her I was not wanting to admit even to myself that my perfect life had complicated shadows. The first truly alarming incident happened about 2.5 years into our marriage. I was looking for a particular book in James's study while he was away in London. While searching the shelves, I accidentally knocked over a stack of folders on his desk. As I gathered the scattered papers, I noticed financial statements showing massive transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I wasn't naive about wealthy people using offshore banking, but the amounts were staggering, and the documentation looked unusual even to my untrained eye. Some papers referenced entities with strange names like Pantheon Holdings and Blue Ocean Enterprises. That didn't sound like typical Richardson investments. When James returned, I casually asked about these companies over dinner. His fork paused midway to his mouth. "Where did you hear those names?" I explained about the fallen papers, trying to sound merely curious rather than suspicious. James's expression darkened. "You were going through my private business documents." "No, I was just looking for a book and they fell. I wasn't snooping." He put down his utensils with deliberate calm. "Those are highly confidential investment vehicles for our most exclusive clients. I would appreciate if you didn't mention them to anyone. Financial privacy is paramount in our business." "Of course," I agreed, unsettled by his intensity. Later that week, I overheard James and Eleanor in heated conversation in the conservatory. "The Sullivan account is asking too many questions," James was saying. We need to keep things quiet until the Dubai transaction clears. We've always managed before, Eleanor replied coolly. Do what needs to be done. They abruptly stopped talking when they realized I was within earshot. James smiled too brightly and asked about my plans for the day as if the tense conversation hadn't been happening. That evening, a locksmith came to install a new security system on James's study. I was no longer able to enter without his key code. A week later, I ran into Diane, a former colleague from the gallery at a charity auction. She pulled me aside with genuine concern in her eyes. Celia, I've been trying to reach you for months, she said. There are some troubling rumours circulating about Richardson Investments. Some collectors we know have been advised to pull their money out. I was worried about you. Before I could ask for details, James appeared at my side, his arm wrapping around my waist in a grip that appeared affectionate, but felt constraining. Diane, wonderful to see you, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid I need to steal my wife away. The Congresswoman is eager to discuss Celia's ideas for the Children's Art Initiative. As he guided me away, he whispered, I don't think you should spend time with her anymore. She's clearly jealous of your position and trying to create problems. That night, when I tried to bring up Diane's comments, James exploded in a way I'd never seen before. Do you realize how damaging rumors can be in our business? Trust is everything, and you're listening to gossip from a failed gallery assistant. Diane isn't failed. She's the assistant director now. I corrected, which only made him angrier. This is exactly why I need you to be careful about who you associate with, he shouted. These people will use you to get to me, to get to the Richardson name. I went to bed that night with a knot in my stomach, the first time I felt genuinely afraid of my husband. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened, kissing me goodbye as he left for the office. But something fundamental had shifted between us. As weeks passed, I began noticing other troubling signs. Hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a room. Strange men in expensive suits arriving for meetings that didn't appear on any official calendar. Financial newspapers left open to articles about regulatory investigations into investment fraud. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation that a business as large as the Richardsons naturally had complicated dealings. But the gnawing feeling in my gut told me something was deeply wrong. I just wasn't ready to admit how wrong it might be or what that would mean for the life I'd committed to. Spring arrived with an unusual announcement from Eleanor. She was planning an elaborate dinner party for the family's closest business associates, something she hadn't done in years due to her increasingly reclusive nature. We need to shore up certain relationships, she told James and me over breakfast, a reminder of the Richardson legacy and stability. James looked surprised but pleased. Excellent idea, Mother. The timing couldn't be better. I was assigned to work with the house staff on preparations, though most decisions had already been made by Eleanor. The guest list included 20 of the wealthiest and most influential people in the financial world, along with 2 federal judges and a retired senator. The night of the dinner, the mansion was transformed with fresh flowers in every room and candles casting a golden glow over the antique furniture. Eleanor wore a deep burgundy dress with the famous blue diamond necklace she had shown me years earlier. James was impeccably dressed in a custom tuxedo, charming and attentive as he greeted guests. I wore a simple black gown with the pearl earrings James had given me for Christmas, playing my role as the perfect hostess. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner was more than a social occasion. There was an undercurrent of tension beneath the polished smiles and casual conversation. During cocktails, I overheard 2 men speaking in low voices near the fireplace. The SEC is definitely asking questions, one said. Masterson had to submit documents last week. Richardson always stays one step ahead, the other replied, though I've moved some assets elsewhere just to be safe. They changed the subject when they noticed me approaching with a tray of canapes. At dinner, I was seated between a silver-haired investment banker and his wife. The banker leaned toward me after his second glass of wine. Your husband has quite the golden touch, he said, studying me closely. Some of us have wondered about his methods over the years. James works very hard, I replied neutrally. Indeed, he smiled thinly, though hard work alone rarely yields 20% returns in a down market. His wife squeezed his arm in warning, and he immediately pivoted to discussing the upcoming symphony gala. Midway through the meal, I noticed James and his longtime business partner, Robert Walsh, exchanged tense looks across the table. When dessert was served, Robert excused himself, and moments later, James followed. Eleanor's eyes tracked them sharply, but she continued her conversation without missing a beat. Concerned, I made my way to the powder room, intentionally passing by James's study. The door was partially open, and raised voices carried into the hallway. You promised this would be resolved months ago, Robert was saying. Now I have auditors crawling through our books asking about transfers to Richardson's subsidiary accounts. Keep your voice down, James hissed Biais. Everything is under control. The Dubai funds will clear next week, and we can balance the Prescott portfolio before anyone notices the discrepancy. That's what you said about the Hansen Foundation, and now they're threatening to go to the authorities. This isn't just creative accounting anymore, James. If what I suspect is true, we're talking about criminal fraud. You're overreacting. We've always managed the numbers. This is no different. It's entirely different when you're using new investor money to pay returns to existing clients. That's a Ponzi scheme, and I won't be part of it. There was a sudden movement, and I quickly stepped back, heart pounding. When the men emerged minutes later, Robert's face was ashen, and James looked coldly furious. They rejoined the party separately, both forcing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I noticed Eleanor watching the entire scene while sipping her third scotch of the evening. Her expression was unreadable, but she never took her eyes off James for the remainder of the night. As the guests began to leave, a distinguished older man, I recognized as Judge Hamilton, pulled me aside in the foyer. "Mrs. Richardson," he said quietly, "you seem like a sensible young woman. Things might get difficult soon. Make sure you have good counsel of your own." Before I could ask what he meant, he patted my arm and walked away, leaving me confused and increasingly alarmed. After the last guest departed, James stormed into our bedroom, loosening his bow tie with jerky movements. "What did Hamilton say to you?" he demanded. "Just something about getting counsel. I didn't understand what he meant." James cursed under his breath. "Stay away from him. He's bitter because he lost money in the tech crash and blames everyone else for his poor decisions." I gathered my courage. "James, I overheard you and Robert arguing. Is there something wrong with the business? Are you in some kind of trouble?" His expression hardened. "You were spying on me." "No, I was passing by and heard raised voices. I'm your wife. If something's wrong, I should know." James paced the room, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. "There's nothing for you to worry about. Just normal business disagreements that Robert is blowing out of proportion." It didn't sound normal. He mentioned fraud, James. He whirled around, eyes flashing dangerously. "This is exactly why you shouldn't eavesdrop on conversations you don't understand. The financial world is complicated. What sounds alarming to an outsider is often just aggressive strategy." I persisted, fear making me brave. "If everything's fine, why are people whispering about SEC investigations? Why did Judge Hamilton warn me?" James grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging in painfully. "Listen to me carefully. We're under attack from competitors spreading rumors to damage us. I need you on my side, not adding to the problem." He released me and went to his briefcase, removing a stack of documents. "I need you to sign these. They're just routine asset transfers to protect our personal holdings from corporate liability." The papers were complex legal documents full of financial jargon. When I hesitated, James's voice turned cold. "Sign them, Celia, now." Hands trembling, I signed where he indicated not fully understanding what I was agreeing to. After I finished, he gathered the papers, without a word, and locked them in his briefcase. That night, as James slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, truly afraid for my future, for the first time since our marriage. Whatever was happening in the Richardson business was serious enough to make a federal judge concerned for my welfare. As dawn broke, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Eleanor, a woman who had never texted me before. "Meet me at the cottage at 10. Come alone. Tell no one." The small caretaker's cottage at the edge of the estate grounds had been Eleanor's private retreat since before I joined the family. No one entered without her explicit invitation. Whatever she wanted to discuss was serious enough to break years of carefully maintained distance between us. I deleted the message, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The next morning, I told James I was going into town for a facial appointment. He barely looked up from his phone, distracted by what seemed to be an urgent email. The walk to Eleanor's cottage took me through the estate's apple orchard, now in full spring bloom. The beauty of the white blossoms against the blue sky felt at odds with the dread building in my stomach. The cottage was a charming stone building that predated the main house, surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Eleanor opened the door before I could knock, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen her. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup, revealing a face more lined and tired than her public persona allowed. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. The interior was surprisingly cozy, with well-worn furniture and shelves crammed with books. No staff were present. Eleanor gestured for me to sit on a floral sofa while she lowered herself carefully into an armchair opposite me. For the first time, I noticed how frail she looked, how her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from a waiting pot. "I've never been particularly kind to you, Celia," she began without preamble. "For that, I apologize." Stunned by this unexpected opening, I simply nodded. "When James brought you home, I saw a naive young woman easily controlled and molded to our purposes. What the Richardson men have always wanted: beautiful, socially acceptable wives who ask no questions." She paused, looking down at her tea. "I was wrong about you. There's a strength in you I failed to recognize." "Mrs. Richardson, Eleanor, what is this about?" I asked, my anxiety mounting. She set down her cup with a sigh. "I'm dying, Celia. Pancreatic cancer, 6 months at most." "I'm so sorry," I said automatically, though my mind was racing with questions about why she was telling me this now in secret. "Save your sympathy," she said with a dismissive wave. "I've lived a privileged life longer than I probably deserved given the choices I've made." She looked directly into my eyes. "Choices that are about to come crashing down on this family." Eleanor rose slowly and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner. From a hidden compartment, she removed a thick manila envelope. "What I'm about to tell you will destroy your marriage and possibly send my son to prison. But you deserve the truth, and frankly, James deserves the consequences of his actions." My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "What truth?" Eleanor returned to her seat, envelope in hand. "The Richardson Investment Group has been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for nearly 20 years." The words hung in the air between us, confirming my worst fears, yet somehow still shocking. "A Ponzi scheme," I repeated numbly, "using new investor money to pay returns to existing clients." She looked surprised at my understanding. "Yes, it began small after my husband died. The tech crash had hit us hard, and we faced our first quarterly loss ever. James was just taking over, eager to prove himself. He convinced me to use a new investor's funds to cover the returns we'd promised to our oldest clients, just until the market recovered." Eleanor's voice grew distant with memory. "But instead of a temporary solution, it became the business model. Take money from new investors, skim millions for ourselves, use the rest to pay impressive returns to existing clients to keep them happy. The reputation for success brought more investors, bigger clients." "But that's not sustainable," I said, trying to process the magnitude of what she was describing. "No, it's not. The scheme requires constant growth, new money flowing in faster than obligations to existing investors. James kept expanding, taking bigger risks, creating more elaborate shell companies to hide the money movements." She handed me the envelope. "This contains documentation of everything. Account numbers, transfer records, the structure of the fraud, names of offshore entities where James has been hiding money. There's over $2 billion of investor money that simply doesn't exist anymore." I felt physically ill. $2 billion. How many people? Hundreds, including charitable foundations, pension funds, and people who trusted the Richardson name with their life savings. Eleanor's voice cracked with what seemed like genuine remorse. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility anymore, that James was running things now, but I knew, I've always known. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, not touching the envelope. "Because the FBI has been building a case for months. I've been cooperating with them secretly since my diagnosis. They're close to making arrests and James has no idea." This revelation sent another shockwave through me. "You've been working with the FBI against your own son." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd ever seen from her. "I've enabled his worst instincts for too long. The diagnosis changed everything, made me see the harm we've caused. James isn't just financially corrupt, Celia. The power has warped him in ways you've only begun to glimpse." She reached for my hand, another unprecedented gesture. "I've watched how he's isolated you, controlled you. I recognized it because his father did the same to me and I let him. Then I did nothing when James started treating you the same way." I pulled my hand away, anger flaring. "If you saw it, why didn't you help me?" "Because I was complicit in creating the system. Because I thought it was how our world worked." She shook her head sadly. "I was wrong too late to fix my own life, but perhaps not too late to give you a chance at something better." Eleanor stood again, moving to a small safe hidden behind a landscape painting. She entered a combination and removed a legal document. I changed my will 6 months ago. The estate, the family diamonds, the Rolls Royce James loves so much, they're all going to you, not him. I stared at her in disbelief. Why would you do that? Because these assets are clean. I kept them separate from the business, legally protected. When everything else is seized and liquidated to repay victims, these will remain untouched. She placed the will next to the envelope. James will hate me for it, but I want you protected when this all comes crashing down. My mind was reeling. What am I supposed to do with this information? You have a choice, Eleanor said simply. You can warn James, help him try to flee the country before the FBI moves in. He has emergency plans, false identities, money hidden, where even I don't know. Or you can cooperate with the authorities, use the evidence I've given you to ensure justice for the victims. You're asking me to betray my husband, I whispered. I'm asking you to choose right over wrong even when it's painful. Something I failed to do for far too long. Eleanor's face suddenly contorted in pain and she grabbed the arm of her chair to steady herself. I rushed to her side. Are you all right? Should I call someone? Just the cancer, she said through gritted teeth. The medication is in the bathroom cabinet. I helped her take her pain medicine and then assisted her back to the main house, our conversation weighing heavily on my mind. As we walked slowly through the orchard, Eleanor leaned on my arm. Whatever you decide, Celia, know that none of this was your fault. You married a man who showed you only what he wanted you to see. We all did. The next 48 hours were the most agonizing of my life. I hid the envelope of evidence in my old art books, where James never looked. I read through the documents multiple times, each review confirming the staggering scale of the fraud and James's central role in orchestrating it. There were records of James moving millions into personal accounts under aliases. Correspondence showing he had personally courted elderly investors, promising them security while knowing their money was already gone. Evidence that he had bribed officials to look the other way during routine audits. Most devastating was finding documentation of properties purchased under false names in non-extradition countries. One such document included travel arrangements and identity papers for James and a woman named Sophia Winters, a name I didn't recognize. A simple internet search revealed Sophia was a 28-year-old former model now working in investor relations at one of James's subsidiary companies. There were photos of them together at business events, standing closer than professionally appropriate. In one image, captured at a financial conference in Singapore, his hand rested possessively on the small of her back, while I was thousands of miles away, believing he was working tirelessly for our future. The betrayal cut deep, but it also severed the last emotional ties holding me back from seeing the truth. James hadn't just lied about business, he had lied about everything, including his commitment to our marriage. I continued playing the role of devoted wife while I considered my options. James, distracted by whatever crisis was unfolding at work, barely noticed my inner turmoil. He came home late each night, locked himself in his study with phone calls, and fell into bed exhausted. Eleanor watched me with knowing eyes during our brief interactions, but said nothing. She had laid out the choice, but was leaving the decision entirely to me. On the third day after Eleanor's revelation, I made my decision. I contacted the FBI using the secure email address Eleanor had provided. Within hours, I received a response requesting a meeting. That evening, I finally confronted James. He was in his study, surrounded by papers, looking haggard and stressed. "We need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. He barely glanced up. "Can it wait? I'm dealing with a situation." "No, it can't wait. I know about the Ponzi scheme, James." His head snapped up, eyes narrowing dangerously. "What did you say?" "I know what you've been doing. Using new investor money to pay fictional returns, stealing billions, creating shell companies to hide the money." I kept my voice steady despite my racing heart. James slowly stood up, his expression shifting from shock to calculation. "Who have you been talking to, Robert?" He's panicking over nothing, trying to cover himself. "Not Robert, your mother." This visibly stunned him. "My mother knows nothing about day-to-day operations. She's confused, possibly senile. She's dying of cancer, not losing her mind, and she's been working with the FBI for months." The colour drained from James's face. For a moment, he seemed genuinely speechless. Then his expression hardened. "Whatever she's told you is a lie to turn you against me. She's always been jealous of our relationship, of the love we share." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Love, is that why you have escape plans that include another woman? Is that why Sophia Winters has a passport matching one of your aliases?" James's eyes widened in shock before he could control his expression. He quickly shifted tactics, moving toward me with hands outstretched pleadingly. Celia, you don't understand the pressures I've been under. Yes, I've made mistakes, taken shortcuts in business. And Sophia, that was nothing, a momentary weakness. Don't lie to me anymore, I said, stepping back from his reach. I've seen the evidence, all of it. The fraud, the affairs, the plans to abandon me when things collapsed. His demeanor changed instantly, the mask of contrition dropping to reveal cold fury. He grabbed my arm roughly. What have you done? Have you talked to anyone else? Not yet, I lied, not wanting him to know I'd already contacted authorities. James released me, visibly calculating his options. Listen to me carefully. We can still fix this. I have money set aside, new identities ready. We'll disappear tonight, start fresh somewhere else. We, I repeated incredulously. Of course we. You're my wife. He moved to his desk and began gathering papers frantically. Pack only essentials. We need to be gone before morning. I watched him dismantling files, feeding some into a small shredder, stuffing others into his briefcase. You're actually planning to run. It's our only option now. If what you say about Mother is true, we don't have much time. He glanced at me, still standing immobile. What are you waiting for? Go pack. I'm not going anywhere with you, James. He froze, then slowly turned to face me. What did you just say? I'm not running. I'm not helping you escape justice for what you've done. His laugh was ugly, devoid of humor. You think you have a choice. You signed those documents too, Celia. Your name is on transfers and accounts. If I go down, you go down with me. Those signatures were obtained through deception. I'll take my chances with the truth. James stalked toward me, his handsome face contorted with rage. You stupid, ungrateful bitch. Everything I've done I did for us. For our future. The houses, the cars, the jewelry you love so much, all paid for with that money you're now so righteous about. I never asked for any of it, I said quietly, and I never would have accepted it if I'd known it came from destroying other people's lives. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me violently. You don't get to claim innocence now. You enjoyed every minute of being Mrs. Richardson, every door it opened, every advantage it gave you. I pulled away from him, anger giving me strength. Maybe I did, but I'm making a different choice now. For a moment, I thought he might hit me. His fist clenched at his side, trembling with barely controlled rage. Instead, he turned away abruptly. Get out of my sight. I have arrangements to make. I left his study knowing it was the last conversation we would ever have as husband and wife. In the hallway, I nearly collided with Eleanor, who had clearly been listening. You've made your decision, she said softly. I nodded. The FBI will be here in the morning. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Good. It's time this ended. She touched my arm gently. Be careful tonight. James is dangerous when cornered. I returned to my bedroom and packed a small bag with essentials, planning to leave the house before James completed whatever desperate plans he was making. But as I was about to slip out, I remembered the documents Eleanor had given me, still hidden in my art books. I couldn't leave them behind for James to find and destroy. Retrieving the envelope required passing by the dining room, where I was surprised to find James and Eleanor seated at opposite ends of the long table. A formal dinner had been laid out, complete with candles and the finest china, as if this were any normal evening. Join us, Celia, Eleanor commanded when she saw me hovering in the doorway. James looked up, his expression unreadable. Yes, join us for what might be our last family dinner. The air was thick with tension as I reluctantly took my seat. The staff had prepared James's favourite meal, beef Wellington, but none of us did more than push food around our plates. To the Richardson legacy, Eleanor finally said, raising her wine glass in a toast that sounded more like a eulogy. James stared at his mother with naked hatred. You betrayed your own blood. No, James. You betrayed everything your grandfather built, everything this family was supposed to stand for. Eleanor's voice was steady, her gaze unflinching. Integrity, responsibility, not theft disguised as financial acumen. Spare me your deathbed morality, James sneered. You were happy enough with the profits when they paid for your jewelry and first-class lifestyle. Yes, I was, Eleanor admitted. My guilt is real, but unlike you, I'm trying to make what amends I can before I die. James turned to me, his smile chilling. And you, my faithful wife, how does it feel to sell out your husband? I met his gaze directly. This isn't about betraying you. It's about not betraying myself anymore. He laughed bitterly. So philosophical. I wonder if your principles will keep you warm when all this is gone. He gestured broadly at the opulent room. "I managed before I met you," I said simply. "I'll manage after." The rest of the meal passed in tense silence. I noticed James wasn't drinking while Eleanor and I both had wine. He was staying sharp, preparing for whatever escape he planned to execute later. When dinner ended, James retired to his study again, locking the door behind him. I retrieved the envelope of documents and added them to my packed bag, then lay fully clothed on our bed, waiting and listening. Despite my determination, fear kept me wide awake. I had no idea what James might do when truly cornered. Around 2 a.m, I heard his study door open and footsteps moving stealthily down the hallway. I tensed, but the steps continued past our bedroom toward the garage wing. Through the window, I saw lights briefly illuminate the driveway before disappearing down the long drive toward the main road. James was running just as I suspected he would. I felt an odd mixture of relief and sadness, knowing what awaited him, regardless of his head start. I spent the remainder of the night in the guest room, farthest from the master suite door, locked a chair propped under the handle just in case James returned. When dawn broke, I watched from the window as 3 unmarked cars came up the driveway, followed by 2 police cruisers. It was time to face the consequences of the Richardson legacy, whatever they might be for me. The FBI agents arrived precisely at 7 a.m. I was waiting for them in the grand foyer, having already directed the confused household staff to cooperate fully. Mrs. Richardson, a tall woman in a dark suit, approached me, showing her credentials. "I'm Special Agent Diane Foster. We have a warrant to search these premises and arrest James Richardson. My husband left sometime in the night," I explained, "but I have information that might help you locate him." I handed over the envelope Eleanor had given me, plus notes on what I'd observed about his escape plans. Agent Foster looked surprised but pleased. "This is very helpful. We'll need to ask you some questions about your involvement." "I understand. I'll cooperate completely." As we spoke, other agents were already fanning out through the mansion, securing computers and documents. Eleanor appeared on the main staircase, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. "Agent Foster," she greeted the FBI agent with dignified calm. "I trust you received my latest communication." "Yes, Mrs. Richardson. Your assistance has been invaluable to our investigation." Eleanor nodded, then turned to me. "They'll find James quickly. He's not as clever as he thinks." She was right. By mid-morning, news came that James had been apprehended at a private airfield 50 miles away, attempting to board a chartered plane to the Cayman Islands. Sophia Winters had been with him, along with 3 suitcases of cash and bearer bonds. The media descended on the estate within hours. Reporters lined the gates. Photographers with telephoto lenses tried to capture images of the family in disgrace. My phone exploded with calls and texts from people I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly eager to reconnect with someone at the center of what was being called one of the largest Ponzi schemes since Madoff. Through Eleanor's high-powered attorney's arrangements were made for me to be interviewed at the federal building rather than taken in handcuffs like James. I spent 8 hours answering questions about what I knew when I knew it and my level of involvement in the family's finances. My ignorance of the details, while embarrassing to admit, was ultimately my protection. The documentation I'd provided, along with my willingness to testify, convinced the prosecutors I had been an unwitting participant rather than a co-conspirator. 3 days after the arrests, I was allowed to return to the estate under certain restrictions. I couldn't leave the state or access the main family accounts, which had been frozen, but I wasn't in custody, which was more than could be said for my husband. The first time I saw James after his arrest was at his bail hearing. He was brought into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, hands and feet shackled. His eyes found me immediately filled with such venomous hatred that I physically recoiled. The James Richardson sitting in that courtroom bore little resemblance to the charming man I had married. His perfectly styled hair was flat and unwashed, his smooth, confident demeanor replaced by barely contained rage. When bail was denied due to flight risk, he turned to look at me again, mouthing words that, though silent, clearly conveyed a promise of retribution. Eleanor attended the hearing separately, her frail condition now publicly known. The press painted conflicting portraits of her either as a remorseful whistleblower, trying to make amends, or as a calculating matriarch, sacrificing her son to save her own legacy. The truth, as I was coming to understand, was somewhere in between. Eleanor had participated in the fraud for years before her conscience, or perhaps her mortality, motivated her to stop it. She had shaped James into the man he became, encouraging his worst instincts before finally trying to curb them when it was too late. A week after James's arrest, Eleanor's health took a dramatic turn for the worse. The stress of the scandal combined with her advancing cancer left her bedridden. The same day the FBI completed their search of the estate, Eleanor's lawyer arrived to formally execute her revised will. I sat in the library still in shock from the past week's events as he explained the details. True to her word, Eleanor had left me the estate itself, the family diamonds, and the vintage Rolls Royce, along with enough funds to maintain them held in trusts that predated and were legally separate from the investment fraud. But why? I asked the lawyer. Why would she leave these things to me rather than to James? The elderly attorney adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Richardson was quite clear about her reasoning. These assets represent the legitimate Richardson legacy before the fraud began. She wanted them preserved and used honourably, which she no longer trusted her son to do. When James was informed of his mother's decision, his fury was so intense that his own attorneys requested additional security measures at the detention centre. He immediately filed challenges to the will, claiming Eleanor had been manipulated and was not of sound mind when making the changes. The legal battles were just beginning, but for the moment I found myself in the surreal position of being the steward of significant Richardson assets, while the Richardson name itself was being destroyed in the public eye. Eleanor died 3 weeks later as the pre-trial hearings for James were getting underway. Her funeral was a small private affair, nothing like the grand public memorial that would have been expected for a woman of her standing. Most of the Richardsons' former social circle stayed away, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. I sat alone in the front pew of the small chapel, neither family nor quite an outsider, occupying a strange liminal space created by Eleanor's final acts of contrition. James was not permitted to attend, though his lawyers had petitioned the court. As summer turned to fall, the legal proceedings intensified. I testified before grand juries and provided depositions for both criminal and civil cases. Victims of the fraud sued the Richardson estate, seeking to recover their lost investments. Through it all, I tried to maintain some semblance of dignity and responsibility. I worked with the court-appointed trustees to identify assets that could be liquidated to help repay victims. I cooperated with investigators tracking money that had been hidden overseas. The most difficult day came when James's trial finally began in earnest. I was called as a witness for the prosecution, forced to testify against my husband, while he sat at the defense table staring at me with cold, dead eyes. "Mrs. Richardson," the prosecutor asked, "when did you first become aware of discrepancies in your husband's business dealings?" I recounted the story of the fallen papers, the overheard conversations, the suspicious dinner party. With each detail, James's expression grew darker. When it was the defense's turn for cross-examination, James's attorney tried to paint me as a gold digger who had married for money and was now saving herself by turning on my husband. "Isn't it true that you enjoyed the lavish lifestyle the Richardson fortune provided? The private jets, the designer wardrobe, the social status?" "Yes," I admitted. "I enjoyed those things not knowing their true cost." "And now that your husband faces prison, you've managed to secure a significant portion of the Richardson assets for yourself, have you not?" "Those assets were left to me by Eleanor Richardson, who wanted them used partly to make restitution to victims." The trial lasted 6 weeks. The evidence against James was overwhelming, bolstered by testimony from former employees, financial experts, and the detailed records Eleanor and I had provided. When the verdict came back guilty on 42 counts of fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion, I was sitting in the back of the courtroom. James turned to scan the crowd until he found me. Even from a distance, I could read his lips as he mouthed, "This isn't over." The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction, only a profound sadness for the waste of a life and the harm he had caused so many others. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about how it felt to see my husband convicted, whether I had known about the fraud all along, what would happen to the Richardson fortune now. I pushed through them without comment, sliding into the waiting car that would take me back to an estate that felt nothing like home. The year following James's conviction was a period of profound grief and slow healing. I mourned not just the end of my marriage, but the death of illusions about who my husband had been and what our life together had meant. I began seeing a therapist who specialized in helping people recover from relationships with narcissists and financial abusers. The parallels she drew between my experience and those of women from much humbler circumstances were eye-opening. Money and social status hadn't protected me from the fundamental dynamics of control and deception. "The guilt you feel is common among fraud victims," she explained during one session. "It's called victim blaming yourself because you think you should have known better." "But I lived in the same house," I argued. I benefited from the stolen money even if I didn't know it was stolen. And now you're doing everything in your power to make amends. That's what matters. Working with Eleanor's attorneys and financial advisors, I established a restitution fund using assets I had inherited that weren't subject to seizure. It wasn't enough to make all the victims whole. James's fraud had been too vast for that, but it was something. I sold the main mansion, finding the memories too painful and the maintenance costs unjustifiable, given how many people had lost their life savings. But I kept Eleanor's cottage, renovating it into a comfortable home that felt more authentically mine than the grand estate ever had. The Richardson diamonds presented another moral quandary. Technically, they were mine legally, having been family heirlooms untainted by the fraud. But wearing them felt wrong when so many were suffering because of the Richardson name. After much consideration, I worked with appraisers to divide the collection. The most historically significant pieces were donated to a museum with plaques acknowledging their complicated provenance. Others were sold at auction with proceeds going to the Victim Restitution Fund. I kept only one small pendant with a single diamond as a reminder of the experience that had transformed my life. The Rolls Royce presented a similar dilemma. James had loved that car more than almost anything, seeing it as the ultimate symbol of Richardson prestige. Selling it brought a particular satisfaction, but instead of keeping the proceeds, I donated the entire amount to a non-profit providing financial literacy education to young people. I kept the car itself, however, retrofitting it for use in charity events and fundraisers. There was a poetic justice in using James's prized possession to help rebuild what he had destroyed. 6 months after the trial, I reopened a small gallery in a renovated industrial space downtown. I focused on emerging artists, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, who lacked the connections that typically open doors in the art world. The gallery wasn't particularly profitable, but it didn't need to be. I had enough from what remained of Eleanor's inheritance to live comfortably while building something meaningful. For the first time since meeting James, I was doing work that reflected my own values, rather than someone else's expectations. My parents, who had watched my Richardson years with increasing concern they were too tactful to fully express, became regular visitors. "You remind me of the daughter we raised," my mother said during one visit, before all the designer clothes and perfect manners covered her up. Old friends from my pre-Richardson life cautiously reconnected, and I built new friendships with people who knew me as just Celia, not as the wife of a notorious fraudster or the inheritor of a tainted fortune. About a year after James began serving his sentence, I received an unexpected visitor at the gallery. Agent Foster, the FBI investigator, who had been present at James's arrest, stopped by during a quiet weekday afternoon. "I wanted to see how you were doing," she said, studying a large abstract canvas on the main wall. "Not everyone rebuilds their life so thoughtfully after something like this." "I'm still figuring it out," I admitted. "Some days are harder than others." "That's to be expected." She turned to face me directly. "I also wanted to let you know that because of your cooperation, we've been able to recover another $20 million in hidden assets from accounts in Singapore. More money for the victims." "I'm glad," I said sincerely. "Would you have time for coffee sometime?" she asked, surprising me. "I've been working financial crimes for 15 years, and your perspective is unique. I'm trying to develop better methods for identifying and helping people in situations similar to yours before things go so far." That coffee led to others, and gradually to a friendship that was refreshing in its directness. Diane, as I came to know her, had no interest in social status or appearances. Her focus on justice and her clear-eyed view of human nature was exactly what I needed as I continued to rebuild my sense of self. Occasionally, I received letters from James in prison. The first few were vicious, full of blame and threats. Later ones became manipulative, attempting to evoke sympathy or nostalgia for our early days together. I read each one carefully, then filed them with my attorney without responding. James still had power over many things, but my attention was no longer among them. 2 years after his conviction, I received news that James had been caught attempting to run an investment scam from inside prison using a contraband cell phone and the help of outside accomplices. His privileges were revoked, and he was transferred to a higher security facility. Some people, it seemed, were incapable of change. By contrast, I was discovering my capacity for growth and resilience. The Richardson scandal had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about James, but about myself, the compromises I had made, the warning signs I had ignored, the values I had temporarily set aside in exchange for comfort and status. "We don't get to choose what happens to us," my therapist said during one of our last sessions together, "but we do get to choose what meaning we make from it." The meaning I chose was to transform my experience into something useful to others. I began speaking at colleges about financial coercion in relationships. I joined the board of a non-profit supporting women rebuilding their lives after economic abuse. And on rare occasions when invited by the FBI or financial regulators, I spoke to their teams about the subtle warning signs of fraud, from an insider's perspective. The inconsistencies I had noticed but rationalized away the red flags that in retrospect had been waving wildly while I deliberately looked elsewhere. 3 years after James went to prison, I found myself at a financial crimes conference, sharing my story with a room full of investigators and regulators. After my talk, a man approached me, the lead prosecutor from James's case. "Your testimony was crucial to our success, he said. "But more importantly, what you've done since then has been remarkable." We talked for hours that evening about justice, redemption, and the complex ethical questions raised by white-collar crime. His perspective was nuanced in a way I hadn't expected from someone in his position, acknowledging the systemic issues that sometimes enable fraud while still holding individuals accountable for their choices. Michael, as I came to know him, had his own complicated history with financial crime. His parents had lost their retirement savings in a scheme similar to James's, fueling his career choice. He understood both the technical aspects of these cases and their profound human impact. Our professional connection gradually evolved into something more personal. For the first time since my marriage ended, I found myself drawn to someone in a way that felt honest and grounded. Michael knew every detail of my past and saw me clearly without illusion or agenda. I was cautious, of course. The experience with James had taught me to look beyond surface charm and to value consistency and integrity above all else. But over time, Michael proved to be exactly who he appeared to be, a thoughtful, principled person committed to making things right in his corner of the world. 5 years after the Richardson scandal broke, I drove the Rolls Royce to a charity gala benefiting fraud victims and their families. Michael was in the passenger seat, smiling at the irony of our using James's prized possession for such a purpose. Around my neck, I wore the single diamond pendant I had kept from Eleanor's collection, a reminder of how far I had come and the responsibility that came with my second chance. "Do you ever regret your decision?" Michael asked as we pulled up to the venue, turning James in knowing what it would cost you. I considered the question carefully, wanting to be honest. I regret not seeing the truth sooner. I regret the harm that was done to so many people while I was looking the other way. But standing up when I finally understood what was happening, no, I don't regret that. Awesome. He squeezed my hand gently. That's why you're making a difference now. You understand both sides of the story. As we walked into the gala, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here, from naive gallery curator to trophy wife, to unwitting participant in fraud, to advocate for victims and change. None of it was what I had planned, but perhaps it was where I had always been headed, the long, difficult path to becoming fully myself. The wealth that remained from Eleanor's inheritance now felt less like a burden and more like a responsibility, a tool for creating something better than what had come before. The Richardson name would always be associated with one of the largest financial frauds in history, but perhaps it could also become associated with healing and restitution. What would you do if you discovered the life you thought you were building was founded on lies and others' suffering? I hope you never have to find out. But if my story has taught me anything, it's that we all have more capacity for both self-deception and courage than we realize. The question is which one we choose when the moment of truth arrives. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and transformation. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between loyalty and doing what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember that our past doesn't have to define our future, and sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most meaningful growth. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I wish you the wisdom to recognize truth when it appears, even when it's not what you wanted to see.